I learned how to be needed before I learned how to be honest. It started early, the way these things usually do, with praise. With approval that arrived when I adapted, when I stayed agreeable, when I became useful. People responded warmly when I anticipated their needs, when I made things easier, when I didn't complicate the room with too many opinions or inconvenient truths. So I adjusted. I told myself this was empathy. Maturity. Emotional intelligence. I told myself that fitting in was a skill, and like any skill, it could take you far if you practiced it long enough. I didn't realize that I was practicing myself out of existence. Over time, my instincts became quieter. Not because they disappeared, but because I stopped trusting them. I learned to check the room before checking myself. To weigh reactions before feelings. To decide who I needed to be before asking who I actually was. And it worked. People relied on me. They came to me for stability, for calm, for solutions. I became the person who could be counted on, the one who would show up, smooth things over, carry weight without asking to be seen carrying it. That role feels noble from the outside. From the inside, it's exhausting. I didn't notice the loss at first. You don't feel yourself disappearing when it happens in small, socially rewarded pieces. You feel accomplished. Appreciated. Necessary. I built my identity around that necessity. If I was needed, I mattered. If I mattered, I was safe. That logic shaped every choice I made. I stayed in situations that required me, even when they drained me. I maintained relationships where my value was measured by how much I could absorb. I chose paths that made sense to others, even when they felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Articulation was the problem. The longer I lived this way, the harder it became to explain discomfort without sounding ungrateful. How do you complain about a life that looks fine? How do you confess emptiness when everyone else sees stability? So I stayed quiet. Silence became my default language. Not the absence of words, but the absence of contradiction. I learned to agree without conviction, to nod without engagement, to smile without warmth. I told myself this was peace. It wasn't. It was compliance. The first time I noticed something was truly wrong, it wasn't during a crisis. It was during a compliment. Someone told me, sincerely, "You're so easy to be around. You never make things difficult." I thanked them. And felt a cold, sinking recognition settle in my chest. Easy meant invisible. Undemanding meant unheard. They weren't praising my character. They were praising my absence. That realization didn't explode into anger. It sat with me quietly, infecting moments that used to feel normal. I started noticing how often my preferences went unexpressed. How quickly I adjusted my tone, my energy, my opinions to match whoever was in front of me. I didn't feel fake. I felt erased. At night, alone, I tried to remember when I had last chosen something without checking how it would land. When I had last wanted something strongly enough to risk disappointing someone. Those memories were vague, like childhood dreams you're not sure actually happened. I had become very good at being what was required. I had no idea who I was without requirements. That scared me more than loneliness ever could. Because loneliness implies there's someone missing. I didn't know if there was anyone left to miss. The thought that followed me everywhere was simple and devastating. If no one needed me tomorrow, would there be anything left? I didn't have an answer. Only the growing sense that I had built a life where my usefulness was essential. And myself was optional. And that meant something would eventually have to break. Either the role, or me. Once that question lodged itself in my mind, it refused to stay theoretical. It followed me into ordinary moments, conversations, routines, small choices that used to feel automatic. I began noticing how quickly I adjusted myself without thinking. How often my first instinct was to ask, "What do they need from me?" instead of "What do I feel?" That instinct had become reflex. Being needed wasn't just something I did, it was how I oriented myself in the world. It gave my days structure and my identity edges. Without it, everything felt dangerously undefined. That's the moral trap of usefulness, it gives you purpose without asking who you are. I started seeing how deeply this role shaped my relationships. People didn't ask how I was doing, not because they didn't care, but because I had taught them not to worry. I was always fine. Always handling things. Always the stable one. And stability, I learned, can become a wall. Behind it, I was shrinking. I began to feel a low-grade resentment I didn't want to admit existed. Not toward specific people, toward the version of myself who never said no. The one who preemptively absorbed stress so others wouldn't have to feel it. The one who called the sacrifice compassion, even when it left nothing behind. Resentment like that doesn't shout. It seeps. It shows up as emotional distance. As fatigue that has no clear cause. As irritation over small things that shouldn't matter. I noticed myself withdrawing while still being present, doing what was required, but without connection. That scared me. Because withdrawal meant I was starting to disappear again, not dramatically, but deliberately. And I knew where that road led. The breaking point came during an interaction so ordinary it almost passed unnoticed. Someone asked me for help, not urgently, not desperately, just casually. The kind of request I would normally agree to without hesitation. And for the first time, I felt something sharp inside me. Not anger. Panic. Because I realized that if I said yes again, it wouldn't be kindness. It would be self-erasure, and if I said no, I wouldn't know who I was without the role. I stood there longer than necessary, silent, weighing something no one else could see. In that pause, I understood the depth of the dilemma I was in. If I continued being needed, I could keep my place in the world predictable, appreciated, safe. But I would remain undefined, always shaped by external demand. If I stopped, I would lose clarity, approval, and the identity I had built my entire life around. I would have to face myself without the mirror of other people's expectations. Both options involved loss. One was visible. The other was internal. For years, I had chosen the internal loss because no one else could see it. Because it didn't inconvenience anyone. Because it allowed the world to keep functioning smoothly. But now that loss had a name. It was me. I realized then that my selflessness had been incomplete. It helped others, but it avoided the hardest responsibility of all, being present for my own life. I wasn't just afraid of disappointing people. I was afraid that without being needed, I would have no proof of my worth. That realization stripped away the last illusion. I saw clearly that I wasn't choosing to help, I was choosing to disappear in a socially acceptable way. And the longer I did it, the harder it became to reclaim anything of myself that wasn't already defined by service. That night, alone, I felt the weight of a question I could no longer ignore: if I keep living like this, who am I doing it for, and what will be left when there's no one left to please? I didn't have answers yet. But I knew one thing with painful clarity: continuing to be needed at the cost of being known was no longer something I could pretend was virtuous. I didn't reinvent myself. That's the lie people like to hear, that once you see the problem, the solution arrives fully formed. That you wake up courageous, decisive, free. What actually happened was quieter. I got tired of disappearing. Not tired in a dramatic way. Not burned out. Just unwilling to keep paying a cost that no one else could see. The exhaustion wasn't physical. It was existential, the fatigue of living a life that required me to be present everywhere except inside myself. The first change I made felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I said no. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just honestly. Without explanation long enough to justify it. Without wrapping it in apologies or alternatives. The silence that followed felt dangerous. I expected tension. disappointment, collapse. Instead, something subtler happened. The world adjusted. Not perfectly. Not comfortably. But it didn't fall apart. People found other solutions. Some asked again. Some stopped asking altogether. A few looked at me differently as if I had violated an unspoken agreement. And maybe I had. The agreement that I would always be available. Always adaptable. Always easy. Breaking that agreement didn't make me heroic. It made me visible, and visibility is terrifying when you've spent years surviving by blending in. Without constant usefulness to anchor me, I felt unsteady. I noticed how empty some of my days were when they weren't filled with obligation. I realized how underdeveloped my own desires had become, how unsure I was of what I actually liked, wanted, or needed when no one else was involved. That uncertainty hurt. But it hurt honestly. For the first time, my discomfort belonged to me. I started listening to myself in small, unremarkable ways. I noticed resistance instead of overriding it. I noticed curiosity instead of dismissing it. I allowed boredom, frustration, longing feelings I had previously smoothed over with responsibility. I didn't become selfish. I became present. Some relationships changed. A few faded. Not because of conflict, but because they had been built entirely around my availability. Without that constant offering, there was nothing left to connect us. That loss stung. But it clarified something important: being needed and being valued are not the same thing. Love that requires your erasure is not love. It's convenience. I began to feel time differently. Not as something I had to fill with usefulness, but as something I was allowed to inhabit. My days felt less impressive but heavier, more real. They carried my weight instead of distributing it to everyone else. I stopped asking myself how to be less of a burden. I started asking how to be more of a person. That shift didn't solve everything. I still struggle with guilt. With the urge to prove my worth through effort. With the instinct to step in before anyone even asks. But now, when that urge rises, I pause. And I ask myself one question, the one I avoided for most of my life: if no one needed me right now, would I still choose to be here as myself? Sometimes the answer is unclear. But the act of asking keeps me present. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels exposed, the quiet exhaustion, the resentment you don't want to admit, the sense that your life is full of responsibility but empty of recognition, I want you to hear this without pressure or urgency: you are allowed to stop being easy. You are allowed to be inconvenient. You are allowed to exist without earning it through usefulness. I became who they needed and lost who I was. Finding myself didn't happen all at once. It began the moment I stopped mistaking self-erasure for kindness. And finally chose to stay in my own life.